Okay, we'll be starting with Moshe Cohen's Shiur on what we're mourning for on Tisha B'Av in just a couple moments. I apologize for technical difficulties up till now.
Before we actually look at the sources, I actually wanted to present a disclaimer which actually has two parts. So my tradition comes from the tradition of the Rav Yosef of Halevi Soloveitchik. So there's two reasons why that's important. The first one is if you look at these sources, a lot of these sources are outside of what is traditionally studied on Tisha B'Av. And that follows in his path. The Torah, and it's one of the halachos that's actually in here. There's a very limited number of things that are traditionally studied on Tisha B'Av. But the Rav, when he used to teach keynote in Boston back in primarily in the 60s and 70s, he went through the entire corpus of Torah. So based on that, I'm willing to expand what's considered Tisha B'Av appropriate material a little bit. The other part is that being a student of students of the Rav is a kind of a way of, or indicates a way of analysis. So it's an analysis method that tends to see things in categories. So that becomes, and not as a separate halakha. So that's going to inform the entire analysis this morning. But it's not the only way to understand any of this material. There are lots of other ways to understand it as well. So I wanted to start with the first source here actually, and you'll forgive me, I'm really quoting this source out of context. It's in the Gemara Yevamot on Daf Man Gimel Amud Bet, and it's really the end of a discussion. The context is about when is a widow allowed to remarry, which is not particularly relevant to this discussion. But the punchline of the Gemara really is relevant. The assumption of the Gemara is that a woman who's widowed, so what the term the Gemara uses is avelut chadasha, new mourning caused by a very recent event, the passing of a loved one, in that case the husband, should be similar to avelut yeshana, this ancient mourning this mourning over the destruction of the temple. So the Gemara says, and you can see it, Ela Amar Rav Ashi, Shani Avelut Chadasha Me Avelut Yishana. So in this particular instance that the Gemara is talking about, they're different. And also, Vishani Avelut Derabi Me Avelut Yachid. The mourning of an individual has different halachic ramifications or halachic categories than collective mourning. The fact that the Gemara had to say that it's different, specifically here, is actually the first indication that in general there are strong parallels between them, and in this specific case they're different. And that's kind of what I wanted to look at. So this first part is a very classic brisker approach to it. So if you look at this next set of sources, and so the Mishnah Torah Rambam in Hilchot Taniyot and the Laws of Fasts, these next three sources, and there are parallel sources from the Shulchan Aruch and Aruch HaShulchan towards the top of page 2. These are all sources that sort of talk about the laws and the requirements of this period of time, the laws that govern the mourning practices on Tisha B'Av and leading up to Tisha B'Av. So the other thing I will just make a comment is that you can kind of see from the Rambam and then through the Shulchan Aruch and the Aruch HaShulchan to what we do nowadays, there's been an evolution of these halachot. I'm not entirely sure why or when, but you can see that the way they're generally practiced nowadays is a lot, I'm going to say, stricter than the way Rambam articulates it. So really the Rambam starts with Yikanes Av Mamatim B'Simcha. When Av starts, you decrease your happiness. And then the week that Tisha B'Av falls on it, you're not allowed to take a haircut or to wash clothes, and to wear freshly ironed clothes, and to do washing and all of these things. But that really what he's talking about is Shavua Shachalba, which is still the practice among Sephardim. But anything before that, from Shivasa B'Tammuz to the beginning of Av sometime, that seems to be totally missing from Rambam. So that's just interesting, because Rambam seemingly didn't have this that we have nowadays. We start to see it a little bit in the Shulchan Aruch on the next page. And he also brings down this custom. And there's a custom also not to eat meat during this week and not to go to the bathhouse. And he says there are also places that don't do shechita, and I'm assuming, although that's not necessarily true, that they also don't eat meat, starting from Rosh Chodesh Av, not just from the week that Tisha B'Av falls out. So if hypothetically Tisha B'Av were on Monday instead of Sunday, Shavua Shachalba would just be the Sunday and Monday. So that would be just 8 and 9 of Av, not starting all the way back from the first day of Av. So to say that you don't do shechita, but you're still able to eat meat prior to refrigeration is a little bit difficult to understand. So I'm assuming when Rambam says they don't do shechita, it means they don't eat meat starting from Rosh Chodesh. Again, that's not the only way to understand that, but that's kind of that's the way I'm understanding it. And then the next halacha is actually the part that I quoted that's about Tisha B'Av itself. So, for instance, Talmidei Chachamim ein notnim zel lazeh shalom b'Tisha B'Av. We don't greet each other on Tisha B'Av. El yoshrim davim v'nachim kaveh, but we sit quiet like Avelim. And if we skip down a couple to the third line in the Hebrew, about the fourth line in the English, so in general, we're not supposed to study Torah on Tisha B'Av, except Ve'en Korei Elav, so we only read the book of Job and the book of Keynote, which is what we call Eicha, B'dvarim hara'im sheb'Yirmiyahu, and the prophecies of destruction in Yirmiyahu, and even and that's also a lot of other sources that point to certain passages in the Gemara that are studied and a couple of other things. And what we actually say is keynote as well. And the last line of the Mitzvah HaChachamim Nohagim Shelo Laniach Bo Tefillin Shel Rosh. And there are certain scholars who did not put on the Tefillin Shel Rosh, the head tefillin. So presumably they would have put on the Yad tefillin, but not the Rosh tefillin, because the Rosh tefillin are associated with Pe'er, glory, which is probably the best translation of Pe'er. And on Tisha B'Av, the aspect of Pe'er, which is associated with the head tefillin, is missing. But that doesn't preclude the arm tefillin, hand tefillin. I actually want to come back to this last halacha and on page 1 later, because I actually put it in the wrong place, which was a little sloppy, but that happens. So at the top of page 2, we have the Shulchan Aruch, which is a couple of generations after Rambam. So he says, so not only he includes not only the things that Rambam includes in what we do and don't do on Tisha B'Av, but he includes a couple of other things. He says, "Me Rosh Chodesh ad Tanit mematim b'masav matan." So starting Rosh Chodesh, from Rosh Chodesh until the fast, we decrease in business and we decrease binyan shel simcha, buildings of joy. So, and again, this is something that is first of all, I think this dates actually back to the Gemara. I think it's much older than the Shulchan Aruch. But it's a category of things that we don't relate to nowadays. I think it originally included, or it was a manifestation of the custom that when a child got married, the father built a house for his son. So I think that's the binyan shel simcha that primarily we're talking about, as well as sort of planting ornamental gardens and some other things. A little bit less relevant nowadays. And also, we have the custom not to get married and not to make a festive meal between Rosh Chodesh Av and the fast day. And the Haggadah, the Ramad, quoting the custom of the Ashkenazim in the last 2 lines of the Hebrew or in the italics in the English, he actually brings down the custom, which is the real source for what most Ashkenazim do nowadays. Is he says is very limited. So he brings down the custom not to get married between the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, which is expanded by even later authorities to mean, so you assume that if there's a wedding, you're playing live music. So even without a wedding, the custom has become not to play live music, and a number of people have taken that not to listen to instrumental music at all, even if it's not live, and that's really a very modern phenomenon because that wasn't possible until a little bit more than 100 years ago. Because physically, there was nothing other than live music. So that's a separate discussion in the development of halakha, which is really interesting, but not really my point. And then the Aruch HaShulchan, which is, again, another couple of generations later, he quotes these halachot from the Shulchan Aruch in a very similar way. It's just he has a much different style of presentation. So these are all the halachot that sort of revolve around this time period that leads up to Tisha B'Av. And I guess if you look at it, the key and important points is, so in the first halakha of Rambam is bathing and getting a haircut and wearing freshly laundered clothes or freshly ironed clothes. A little bit unclear precisely what that refers to. not greeting people, not learning, and not eating meat, and then not getting married in this time period, and building the um, buildings of joy. So that's the first set of halachot. The second set of halachot that I wanted to look at is actually from Rambam in the Laws of Mourning. So that's starting below the line on page 2 and continuing for the first half of page 3. So there's all these halachot here. So first of all, he introduces, Rambam always introduces things. So he introduces a positive mitzvah to mourn and exactly how that developed. But really the halakha that's perhaps more interesting to me is the second halakha on this page, which is from Laws of Mourning 4:9. So he talks about ha'evel b'yom rishon, a person who's mourning on the first day of mourning, is asur lahaniach tefillin. He is actually prohibited from putting on tefillin. But on the rest of the days, he's allowed to eat from his own and sit on the ground and some other things that, again, those customs have mostly fallen by the wayside. But the last word in that paragraph is to put on tefillin. So that already, we're seeing perhaps a manifestation of what the Gemara says. The fact that the Gemara ties the Avelut Yeshana, which was the first set of halachot, this ancient mourning, to the new mourning, which is the first one we see in the Rambam's presentation, is not putting on tefillin. So again, that's the custom that on Tisha B'Av there was a custom. It's no longer practiced not to wear tefillin shel rosh. Rambam is recording a very, very similar custom, or in this case halakha, about the first day of mourning for a relative. And then in the next halakha, chapter 5, paragraph 1, which is the last paragraph on page 2, says, these are the things that a mourner is prohibited to do on the first day as a biblical law, and on the remainder of the days of mourning as a rabbinic law. So he is forbidden to take a haircut, and to bathe, and to wash clothing, and to bathe, and to anoint himself, and to have intimate relations, and to wear sand, to wear shoes, and do work, and study Torah at all, and lizkofet hamita, to put his bed upright. Again, that's something that we no longer do. And lifroat rosho, again, he's not allowed to leave his head uncovered. That's culturally no longer relevant. And this last one, flishol shalom, and to greet others. And so again, all of these halachot in Rambam are very, very parallel to the halachot we see by the Avelut Yeshana, by this time period of Tisha B'Av. So these halachot that we're looking at here are the week of mourning, what nowadays we call the Shiva. So these are the things that are generally prohibited, certainly on Tisha B'Av, and they've sort of bled over into the week before Tisha B'Av. But I think this next halacha, I think, is probably the one that informs it a little bit more. I actually got these in the wrong order, so I was kind of getting used to the way organizing sources works in Safari, and got these first two on page 3 flipped. So if we go to the 520 halacha first, which is the second paragraph, so he's actually talking about how do we know that a mourner is not allowed to greet others. It's because he's quoting from Yechezkel, or he's taking the source from Yechezkel, Haneg Dom. So he said the command to Yechezkel was to be silent, was to mourn in silence. And then there's specifics of halacha, but which I'm less interested in. But again, that's one of these things that applies to Tisha B'Av itself, is we don't greet each other. Now, the one that I should have put next is the one that's at the top of page 3, is Laws of Mourning 6:1. It says, Midivrei Sofrim, rabbinic law has it that a mourner behaves or acts in a way of Avela, not just for the days of Shiva, but for this 30-day period following the death of the relative. So what does that include? So if you skip down to the third paragraph, so he said, which is Laws of Mourning 6:2. So these are the things that an Avel, a mourner is prohibited to do for the first 30 days. So prohibited for taking a haircut, and Tiyutz is ironing probably, and wedding, and Simcha Me're'ud, and attending a social gathering, if you like the translation, or gathering. Happiness from friendship is probably a little bit more literal. And also to go and do business. So all of these things are, a lot of them are actually verbatim from what Rambam presents back on the sort of the first set of halachot on page 1. The things that we're not allowed to do on the 9 days of Tisha B'Av. Sorry, no, not right. The first 9 days of Av leading up to Tisha B'Av. Rambam doesn't act, because of the way the halacha developed, Rambam doesn't really articulate the prohibitions that apply to the week starting from Shivasar B'Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, going up to Rosh Chodesh Av, because seemingly Rambam did not have any prescriptions during that time period. Again, Rambam is reasonably thorough, so in fact he is thoroughness and personified. So if he doesn't record it, he did not have that as halacha, presumably. So, but the way the halacha developed post Rambam, all the way through Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah up until the more recent poskim, is that the halacha has developed such that, this is really the way the Rav articulated it. If you see halacha as category, or if you see the mourning for a relative, the Avelut Chadasha, as a mirror image of the Avelut Yishan, of this ancient mourning, or maybe the ancient mourning is a mirror image of the fresh mourning. So you start to see this in the Rambam, how the halachot are applied from one place to the other place, because the Rambam, for mourning for a relative, he casts it all the way back, some of it to Moshe Rabbeinu, which is about as ancient as we get. And some of it was Divrei Sofrim, which was more recent, but probably still post-exilic. So the way the Rav understood this, and I find this compelling, is that the way the halakha was developed, and was actually very intentional, they took the chachamim, when they were developing the laws and trying to create a framework for understanding the destruction of the temple, they actually took the laws of mourning over a relative and took the same laws but inverted them chronologically. So mourning for a relative, a person goes from the most intense mourning, which is the first day of Avelut and Rambam, and the Shiva, and it sort of diffuses out, if you like, or gets less intense as time goes on, however you want to say that. The mirror image of that, then, is it starts relatively light or relatively unintense, and it actually gets more intense. So we go from what we have nowadays between Shivasar B'Tammuz and Rosh Chodesh Av is actually very parallel to what we do for the year of mourning if a person loses a parent. Then when we go from Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av itself, that's the halachot of what we see in the laws of mourning 6:1 at the top of page 3, and if I can find, and for instance, if you're looking at the Shulchan Aruch, it's the top of page 2, and that's just really convenient the way these are stapled. things we don't do for Rosh Chodesh Av until Tisha B'Av itself are the things that a person in Shloshim doesn't do, the way the Rambam has it. So, so to take a haircut and to iron clothing and to get married and to have social gatherings and to do business, or at least to limit business. So those halachot are parallel. And then the last set of halachot, which is what a person does during Shiva, which is on the first page, is really what we do on Tisha B'Av itself. And that's, among other things, sitting on the floor and not wearing shoes and all these other things that were, I seem to have lost the Rambam. Yeah, so it's in Hilchot, the laws of mourning, basically the last two paragraphs on page 2. Those are the things that a mourner doesn't do during Shiva, or does do, which are also the things that we don't do on Tisha, or do on Tisha B'Av, whether they're things you do or don't do. So the last halacha in this unit is Laws of Mourning 6.3. I actually found this interesting because I hadn't actually found this inside before. So he's asking basically what are the prohibitions of getting your hair cut? So he says, just like it's, so he's saying, just as it's forbidden to cut hair, to cut any hair or to shave, or to cut fingernails during the period of Shiva, it's also assur to do that during the period of 30 days of mourning for a relative. So this last halacha, it's the last line, sort of the last line and a half in the Hebrew, and the last, looks like 3 lines in the English. So it's talking about a person observing 12 months of mourning for a parent. The halacha, as Rambam presents it, is he actually has to gadel sa'aro, to grow out his hair until it's messy, ad sheyishlach pera, until it gets messy, or until one of his friends or several of his friends basically yell at him and say, "You look like a schlub." And that actually has a very, very interesting practical application nowadays. So for students who are followers or people who are followers of the Rav, they will actually shave both during the Sfirat HaOmer period and during the first part of the 3 weeks period, if they would generally shave every day or every other day, because the Rav saw this as not something specifically your friends actually have to yell at you about, but it's the idea that you're maintaining a standard of appearance. So if you would ordinarily shave every day or every other day or so, then the students of the Rav will do that during the first part of the 3 weeks because it's an application of the same set of halachot and the same understanding of this halachic rubric. The other thing I wanted to kind of throw out here as part of this idea is something a little bit more experiential, I guess, for lack of a better word coming to me, is that I think it's natural for a person at the passing or just after the passing of a close relative to feel mourning. And then that feeling, it doesn't go away, but it gets easier to live with, or it maybe dissipates a little bit or something. So it attenuates over time. And the halacha more or less follows that. However, this is something that I really struggle with, is feeling the mourning for the temple and for everything surrounding the temple is so foreign. It just, I struggle with it because it's reflecting a reality that's totally different and that honestly I don't relate to. But that's kind of what these halachot are trying to lead us towards. we start with this lower level of mourning to kind of say, okay, well, maybe there's something wrong, something we're missing. And it kind of escalates or intensifies to come up to Tisha B'Av when we're actually mourning for the period of time that's the pinnacle of the mourning, which is also the pinnacle of the halakha, or the strictest application of the halakha. So I mean, if you'll pardon me for introducing Sefer HaChinuch into this. The thesis of the Sefer HaChinuch is that a person, really broadly, is that a person is affected by their actions. So, as opposed to in, quote, regular mourning over a relative, where the halacha is almost to give form to the emotions, or to kind of regulate the emotions or something like that. Here, the halacha is actually trying to create the emotions, or to at least to create an atmosphere where the emotions can develop, however precisely you want to articulate that. Now, what I wanted to do, so far is more or less classic Torah of the Rav. What I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce another idea, and this is one of those sources that got thrown in the wrong place by accident, if I can find it, is that there's a third set of mourning, or third application of mourning, and this is actually at the bottom of the first page because I just put it in the wrong place. Misha ra'a arei Yehuda b'chor banav. If a person sees the cities of Yehuda, which is kind of the heartland of the ancient Jewish settlements, especially I think in the Second Temple time period when most of the 10 tribes were no longer there. So I think, again, this is a guess, but I think the Jewish presence in the northern part of the country was much less. I think most of the Jewish presence was in kind of the southern part of the country. What was the southern part of the country then, what's now the central part, sort of the Jerusalem area expansively. I think, for instance, up where Tel Aviv is now was probably much less settled. Again, that's a guess, because the 10 tribes had been exiled at the end of the first temple period. So by the time you have the second temple, they were not brought back. So I suspect most of the people converged on the Jerusalem area. Again, that's a guess. I don't know that that's true for sure. So we have this halakha. It's a person, and this is practiced in some ways, even nowadays. The person sees the cities of Yehuda, b'chor banam, as they are destroyed, as ruins. Then a person says, Harei kachachayim midbar, the cities of your holiness, what became wasteland or desert. And they actually do kriya, they tear their shirt. The person sees Jerusalem destroyed, Yerushalayim midbar, so there's another verse that a person says and does kriya. And finally, if the person sees the Beit HaMikdash, or the Makom HaMikdash, if the person sees where the temple was, but obviously is not right now, b'chor bano, so he sees it as a ruin, says, Beit Kadshenu v'tifartenu, our holy temple, our pride was destroyed, the Korea, and does kriya. And certainly the last halakha here is practiced nowadays. The first two, not so. It's seemingly that's no longer practiced. And I just thought this last piece here was interesting as a slight tangent. So from where does he start to tear? Or slightly better, where does a person stand when they make their first tear? It's the first place where you see Jerusalem, which is Har HaTzofim, and that's a name that's actually preserved nowadays. There's a Jerusalem, Har HaTzofim in modern Jerusalem is probably the first place, if you're coming, I think, from the south, where you will be able to see the ancient city of Jerusalem, or what's now called the Old City. So I would like to sort of throw out this idea that the three concentric circles of mourning, if we look at Avelud Yeshana, the concentric circles, if you like, going outwards of Tisha B'Av itself, of the 9 days, as the Ashkenazim practice it, and as the rest of the 3 weeks, which is as it's practiced nowadays, is roughly parallel to this idea of these concentric circles of mourning about the physical location itself. So it's not just mourning in space, or maybe it's not just mourning in time, but it's also mourning in space, and they're in slightly different dimensions, but I want to say they're parallel. So when you look at the Tisha B'Av itself commemorates the destruction of the temple itself. So those two are both in time and in space centered around the same point, if you like. The destruction of Jerusalem, I want to say, even though chronologically or historically this is less accurate, but I want to say that it's sort of parallel to our mourning for the 9 days. So, and I would like to say something along the lines of, separate from the temple, having Jerusalem as a place, whether you want to see that as political or social or religious or however you want to say that, the fact that we're missing that is deserving, and we're missing that in its fullest manifestation of full sovereignty and all those things. That's kind of parallel to the remainder of the 9 days. And then the fact that we're missing the ancient Jewish heartland of all of Yehudah, which is, and certainly there's an interesting discussion which I will leave to the rabbi about exactly how to do these nowadays, but certainly when these halakha were codified back in the Middle Ages, there was no Jewish sovereignty in any of these places. So I would say that the fact that the Arei Yehudah were b'churbanam, the cities of Judea, were b'churbanam, were wilderness largely. That in and of itself is also deserving of mourning, and that's roughly parallel to the mourning for the first part of the 3 weeks. I would also like to present, and this is admittedly a little bit more speculative, that the 3 parshiot that we typically read as a lead up to the 3 weeks also have, I'm not going to say references because that's too strong of a word, but I'm going to say allusions to these as well, which is why, for instance, starting at the bottom of page 3, I've quoted this Ramban. I found this Ramban actually, 1, very insightful, but 2, actually very moving. Because this is towards the end of Parshat Pinchas, or the story part of Parshat Pinchas, where Moshe has sort of set up Moshe Rabbeinu has set up the framework for the distribution of the land. He's actually dealt with the Benot Tzalafchad, which is about how women inherit property, which is well beyond the scope for today. But then he's told by Hashem, Alei el har havarim hazeh har nevo. So go up this Mount Abarim, mountain of Abat, however you want to translate that, and look at the land. So I found I don't think I can actually do better than to quote Ramban himself. So he says, this command was not meant to be implemented immediately. So this statement, go up, is not a commandment which the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded Moses to fulfill now. But rather, if you skip down a few lines, it was supposed to happen in another couple of weeks or months. And it was really saying, and it's sort of about a little bit more than halfway down in the English, for since he had commanded Moses, unto these the land shall be divided, he informed him that it was not to be divided by you, but instead you shall go up into the top of the mountain of Abarim before Israel journeys away from the land of Moab. and you will die therein. But, and this is the consolation, I think, and you will, and all you, and you will have the land be in sight thereof. Sorry, that translation got very convoluted. So the Hebrew is the only portion that you will have in the land is being able to see it from a distance. So first of all, there's a distinct possibility that Har Havarim was more or less directly across the Jordan River from the Arei Yehuda. So I think it's relatively south, at least the way the ArtScroll Chumash has it. It's south towards the Dead Sea, which is very, I don't know how the topography works, but I think if you could look out over anything, Moshe Rabbeinu would have been seeing what was Arei Yehuda, the Judea region. Again, that part is a bit of a speculation, I think, but I think the idea is that this is both Moshe Rabbeinu's mourning, but also his consolation for not being able to go into the land, but he can see it. So I think that's sort of parallel to what we are mourning for the first part of Tisha, the first part of the 3 weeks, the Jewish occupancy of the land kind of writ broadly, as the way Rambam articulates it, Arei Yehuda b'Korbanam. And Pinchas, just as a disclaimer, is not always read during the 3 weeks, but it's always read either during the 3 weeks or just before the 3 weeks. And again, that just depends on precisely how the calendar comes out. The next quote here, at the top of page 4, this is actually from about halfway through Parshat Moshe. So it's the commandment for when the Jewish people go into the land, that they're supposed to divide out or set aside cities for the Leviim. Tzava b'nei Yisrael, so you shall command the Jewish people, and they shall give to the Levites from their portion cities in which to dwell, and not only cities in which to dwell, but migrash, a green space, I guess, pasture. They shall give to the Leviim pasture around their cities, and so on and so forth. And then if you continue on that part of the Bamidbar, there's a whole bunch of details, etc., which, again, is not perhaps the focus this morning, not my focus at any rate. And again, I want to say that a reference is too strong of a word, but perhaps this is an allusion to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem, if you like, was the city of the Levites par excellence. Jerusalem was not specific to a tribe, it was a place for everyone. And I think that's a little bit what the cities of the Levites were as well. They were places for the Levites to live, but for instance, anyone, if they were accused of unintentional murder, could and would go live there. So I think Jerusalem is a kind of an expanded version of that. It's also the city, the Levites were also the scholars, and the role that's nowadays filled by the rabbi, or the rabbis in general, of being the scholar and the teacher and the counselor and the Moreh Halacha, those who paskin halacha. All of those roles, I think, were filled by the Kohanim and the Leviim in the times of the temple. And that's also what Jerusalem was. It was the place of holiness and the place where there was concentrated Torah learning, perhaps more than any of the other cities of the Levites. So I think this, which is in Parshat Moshe, is also kind of an allusion to Jerusalem, which is I'm saying that we mourn during sort of the first part of during the 9 days. And the last part that I wanted to bring was the Hemek Davar, which is the Netziv, I believe, on Devarim, which And this is actually not from this week's Parsha. There's a reference in Parsha Devarim, Min hamakom hahu, or something that sounds very much like that. So I wanted to, and I apologize, I should have put that source here as well. But this is the Hemok Davar a little bit later in Devarim, trying to articulate what this concept of Min hamakom hahu asher yivchar Hashem, from the place which Hashem chooses. So, and I wasn't able to find a translation for this, so I'm going to freehand it. So the pasuk doubled this idea. So this place, which God shall choose, to really to explain it. So it's not just because that place where ultimately the Sanhedrin meets is because they're greater in scholarship, because that's not sufficient, because a person could say, well, I know more than those guys in Jerusalem. Because I know more than they do, so maybe they're ruling one way. I would like to rule a different way. And I think I'm greater than theirs, so I'm going to go do it my own way. But a person should know that this place which is chosen, and this is the place where the Sanhedrin sat, and the Sanhedrin actually sat in the temple complex. Misayeh harbe, the place itself helps a tremendous amount or halacha to actually be able to bring the halacha out to its ultimate truth. And that feeling ultimately is really what I have trouble relating to for Tisha B'Av. I mean, the fact that God's presence is so manifest that it can affect the way people think, or it can kind of, if you like, nudge people in the right direction. That's something that I don't relate to nowadays. So as much as anything else, it seems like the fact that I don't understand it is something worth mourning about. And I think, and I'd actually like to sort of close, and I think I'm more or less at the end of my time, with this Mishnah Torah, the last paragraph on page 4. And again, this is Rambam in the Laws of Mourning, not specific to this time period, but I think it's generally true. If a person does not mourn the way the Chachamim have commanded, they are considered a fool person. So if a person does not mourn, he should take that as a reason to be fearful and to worry and to examine his own actions and to do tshuva. And so I think that kind of, again, to me, this is not perhaps the classic articulation of why we mourn on Tisha B'Av or the consequences of not mourning on Tisha B'Av. But I think perhaps, to me, it's a little bit more profound because this period of mourning is supposed to try and evoke in us a whole set of feelings of loss and of things that are missing. And it's hard. It's cold, and I feel a lot of the time I feel like one who is not mourning the way the Chachamim want us to, the way the Chachamim want us to experience these 3 days, these 3 weeks. And that in and of it, and just because it's hard to relate to, it's hard to understand what the Chachamim wants. I can read the halacha, but it's hard to really understand the feeling that they were trying to instill in us. And that in and of itself should and does cause me sometimes to worry, to yivchad, to be fearful that I'm missing something, and to worry and to try and understand why I'm not getting it. I guess that that's really why I wanted to put this last halacha Rambam here, because it's personal to me because I just feel like I'm missing something experientially. So, and I'm Right.
Thank you.
Sure. Moshe, we will be back at 5:45 for Moshe Cohen's shiur on Tisha B'Av in the Twilight Zone, followed by Mincha and Mariv, and you can help me communion for Mincha Mariv, that would be great.
There's a big cottage still up there, that seems for parents, not for other houses. Right, but